Welcome to the Value Stuff Podcast. I am your host, Dan Glazier, and I am a personal property appraiser, and I value stuff for a living. Thank you so much for listening. Please share and subscribe so we can grow this podcast. It's relatively new, but we want to grow this so we can help thousands and thousands and thousands of people out there. So thank you so much for listening. Today, I want to continue on with the what's hot, what's not, but I'm really just going to talk about what's hot. And there's hundreds and thousands of things that are hot and things that are not. But specifically today, I want to talk about something that I actually really enjoy appraising and have a lot, and I find value for people in, and that is vintage toys. And a lot of times our vintage toys are in an attic, or they're in a basement, or they're in a storage locker, but there could be thousands of dollars. So I'm going to list 15 different sort of vintage toys and kind of collectibles that I like. I could list hundreds of different things that might have value potentially, but let's just stick to some vintage toys and collectibles here. And I got a list of 15. So let's get started. So right off the bat, what's hot right now, and there was a movie made about this not too long ago, and that is Barbie dolls. So Barbie dolls, are all Barbie dolls hot and collectible? No. The ones I'm talking about, because this really is to do with vintage. What I mean by vintage, anything pre-2000. But when it comes to Barbie dolls, because they've been around since the 50s, I think the first Barbie doll was 1956. By the way, if you have a 1956 Barbie doll in good condition, you've got something worth crazy amounts of money, thousands of dollars. But I'm talking pre-1970s Barbie. So any Barbie or any Barbie accessory or anything from the 1950s and 60s, that's what we're talking about. So any vintage Barbie dolls, pre-1970s, 1950s, 1960s. There are some exceptions. In the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, there were some limited edition Barbies. There was one that I believe was released in Australia in the 2000s, had diamonds all over it. That's worth, I think, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they're limited edition ones, meaning there's not a lot of them out there. Those are the ones from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. What we're talking about, though, what I'm talking about is vintage toys. I'm talking about any pre-1990 Barbie dolls. You might have something worth several hundreds of dollars, even thousands of dollars. Let me talk about something that's important when we go along this whole list here of the 15 items that I have is condition. Just like when we talk about real estate, location. When it talks about collectibles and vintage, especially toys, condition. And to go with condition is if you have original packaging, if it's unopened, it can be worth 10 times the amount, even if of one that's worth several hundreds of dollars. But being in good condition is really important because a lot of these toys got played with. So there's not a lot of condition. Like Barbie dolls, sometimes people cut the hair on them or they did different things, people played with them. So that's why we're talking about pre-1970 Barbie dolls, and we're talking about ones that are in good condition, and even better if you have original packaging. Okay, let's move on to something else that's hot right now, and it's hot. I'm finding even adults. When I'm talking about vintage, a lot of these vintage toys are adults are reliving their youth and they're collecting them. But I'm finding, Lego sets. And I'm talking about classic Lego sets from the 80s and 90s. People, people are using them to help with anxiety. So the ones, though, that are real collectibles, though, are sets from the 70s and 80s, and ones that have all their pieces. Because if you think about Legos, it's easy to have a few pieces missing and stuff, especially if it's like it was a Star Wars one, or it was one that was released that, some kind of truck or something like that. But you need all the little tiny pieces that go with it too. So classic Lego sets are hot in 1970s and 1980s. I will be doing other podcasts where I might just take one or two of these and I might get more specific to say, like, if it's a Barbie doll, look for this specific Barbie doll, or if it's a Lego set, this specific Barbie doll. This is more in general, just to give it, things you might just be having stored away somewhere. So it's going to be more general, not specific, but it gives you an idea. So number one was Barbie doll. Number two is Lego sets. Number three, vintage Transformers from the 1980s. And I'm talking about Transformers. I'm talking about the figurines. I'm talking about the accessories that go with it, some of the little spaceship vehicles and things like that. So any vintage Transformers from the 1980s, especially again originally packaging. When I was doing the research for this podcast, I found one that had sold for a few $100s, but there was one that was in the original packaging unopened, and it sold for several thousands of dollars. But they pretty much have to be in good condition. If they're not in the best condition, but still, okay, fair condition, they still could have some value. So don't throw these out just because they're not in perfect condition. So moving on to Transformers, very similar, Masters of the Universe figurines. And most of these figurines and the accessories that go with it, they were made in Taiwan and Malaysia. But if you have Masters of the Universe figurines and they were made in Argentina, those are the most valuable. The Masters of the Universe figurines are still valuable and still very collectible right now, but the ones in Argentina especially. Sticking to the sort of figurines and figures, let's move on to Star Wars, which always seems to be on every list that you check every year. Our Star Wars figurines and accessories. 1978 to 1994. Those are the ones I'm specifically talking about. Those are the ones that seem to have the most value. So vintage Star Wars figures and figurines, 1978, 1984. If you have some original packaging, you likely have several hundreds to several thousands of dollars worth there in figures and stuff. Moving on, let's talk about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This is number 6 on the list. And I'm talking the, same thing from the 80s and 90s. They're really hot right now. People are collecting them. They're selling for, several, some of them sell for several hundreds of dollars into the thousands on eBay and other places. But again, condition, original packaging, if you have it, is important. It's not essential that they're perfect or, close to perfect or having the original packaging. I'm just saying that they could be worth, several thousands of dollars if you have the original packaging and they're in good condition. Moving on from number 6, which was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, number 7, vintage My Little Pony toys, hot. Seem to be really highly collectible. Almost everything on the list, has to be in fairly good condition. And also, if you can have original packaging, worth a fortune. So vintage My Little Pony toys. Moving on we'll stick to the figurines kind of theme. G.I. Joe action figures, vintage ones though, not new releases. A lot of these, things on this list, there's a lot of reproductions. There's a lot of re-releases of them. Those won't have the same type of value as the ones I'm talking about. Well, the ones I'm talking about are ones that are original, vintage, and that's what I'm talking about, the G.I. Joe figurines. So moving on from figurines, let's talk a little bit about cars, like the little Hot Wheel cars. But when I'm talking about Hot Wheel cars, I'm talking about rare early edition ones. Those are the ones we're looking for that value. I'm finding there are some of them in people's collections. They have just like a box of toys, and then all of a sudden they have some of these Hot Wheel cars, early editions. Similar, that's number 8 on the list. Similar, number 9 on the list would be Matchbook cars. And Matchbook cars, we're looking for the older first run Matchbook cars, could be some value. Let's move on to number 10 on the list, Fisher-Price toys. And I'm talking about the Little People line, those little people that came, especially the ones that are the wood ones, because the really, really early ones are the wood peg ones. They still make these Little People ones. They're now little molded plastic ones. The wooden peg ones are really, really valuable. the molded plastic ones, the early ones are still have some value, but the ones that have the wooden peg style, those are the ones that are really, really valuable. Moving on, vintage board games. And vintage board games, there's bars that are open now and clubs where people just, they go to just play vintage board games. Vintage board games, like the Lego, you have to have the boxes and the box in good condition and have the original pieces. They could be very, very valuable. Almost every house that I do an appraisal for these days will have some board games. Most of them are worn out. A lot of them are missing pieces. A lot of the boxes are taped together and stuff. That's what I'm talking. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about vintage board games that almost are like new condition, but are in at least fairly good condition, where the box is in really good condition and all the pieces are there. That's what we're talking about, vintage board games, but some of them could have some value there. Moving on, number 13 on the list, the original Atari console plus the games. Hot, hot, hot. Has to be in working order. The games have to be working, but the original Atari, there's been a lot of re-releases of Atari, but I'm talking the original console and the original games. They could be worth a mint. But so if you have those and they're in good working condition, you have something there that's a very collectible. Moving on to, this isn't a toy per se, but vintage DC comics, and I'm talking older vintage DC comics. There's definitely a whole topic about comic books because, some, your first Supermans and, Spider-Mans and, all those ones could be worth a fortune, but I'm talking the DC, especially the Superman, the Batman. But there's some very like vague ones that came out. But if they're older DC, they can be worth a lot. You can go online. If you have some of these comics, you can go online and you can check out and say the ones I have, they're numbered, they have a date, they're easy to find. Is this valuable or not valuable? It gives you an idea. Again, condition, especially comic books. You want to make sure there's no tears in them. They're, lightly used or read. If you have one that's in mint condition in the plastic, you could have something there worth a fortune. But comic books are graded very strictly, whatever, you can look at it, but let's just say between 1 and 10. Most comics that I come across are not even, they're below a 5 or a 4 as far as condition. But DC comics, if you have some older ones, they could be valuable there. Older vintage DC comics. Moving on to number 15, I'm just going to talk about this. I could talk about for hours and hours and hours, but I'm just going to do a generalization here. Sports cards, but pre-1979. I can't tell you how many people have sports card collections that are from the 1980s, 1990s into the 2000s. Mass produced, usually not a lot of rare ones in there. There's always an exception to the rule. There's a few collectible ones that are in there from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But the ones that really have value, the ones that are really collecting, are pre-1979. So sports cards. So those are the 15 items or toys or items that I think right now are highly collectible. I could do a list of 100 things, probably 200 things that are vintage and collectible and stuff. But these are just ones. These just tend to be the ones that as I'm doing appraisals or people are calling me, I'm seeing that they're actually in people's collections and they don't even realize they have something there that could be valuable. People love to think just because things are older, they're valuable. Not necessarily, but anything sort of, a lot of these, what I listed are hot right now, and you could have some value there. I'm going to do some honorable mentions here. Any pre-1970s vintage toys, you have a good chance it could have some value there if they're in good condition or fairly good condition. And when I talked about sports cards, I could also talk about, Pokemon cards, and I talked about the Atari. I also could have put in there Game Boys, the original Game Boys and toys. When I was talking about Hot Wheel cars, Matchbook cars, I also could have mentioned the Dinky toys or the Corgi toys. they have value. The older ones, especially, original boxes, condition. It's sort of the same theme through all this stuff. Condition, if you have original boxes and stuff, you really have some of the value there. I have to I'm going to talk about one here because it seems to be on every list. I don't understand it. I haven't found any that are worth a lot. Beanie Babies, they made millions of these things, but I think there's a few out there that are valuable. I actually have never come across any that are that valuable. I've come across ones like, $30, $40, but there are some out there worth several thousands of dollars. If you have Beanie Babies, do your research, make sure it's apples to apples. When I got the Beanie Babies, and people say I have this Beanie Baby, it's very valuable, and this one's very valuable. When I actually compared it, it wasn't the ones that have value. Similar, but not the ones that have value. So that's what I have for you today. What's hot? Vintage toys. Basically, I could kind of say almost all vintage toys are, hot. Some are hotter than others and stuff like that. But these are 15 that I find that people have not a lot of, but they have in some of their collections that are, just hidden away in basements and tucked away, or they were going to donate and stuff like that. So I hope this was informative. I really do enjoy vintage toys and stuff like that. You could have some potential value in there. You have to do your homework, though. Just a tip here. You have to do your homework. Don't just say, oh, I have a Barbie doll and it's valuable. Is it pre-1970s? Is it in good condition? Do your homework. There's a lot of information out there, but vintage toys, hot. Thank you so much. Please subscribe and like and share and all that. This podcast can be found on all the major podcast hosts. Thank you so much. I'm Dan Glazier, the Value of Stuff podcast. Have yourself a wonderful week. Thank you. Take care.